Bene, e siamo qui per questa seconda lecture del professor Heather e ringrazio i colleghi che sono venuti dall'università e gli allievi soprattutto che sono qui. C'è evidentemente una continuità tra la lezione di ieri e quella di oggi. Al di là del tema è una continuità che immagino di approccio, in cui appunto il problema della cristianizzazione dell'Europa a partire dal IV secolo è stato, come abbiamo visto ieri e sarà anche oggi, problematizzato nel contesto più ampio dell'assetto istituzionale, politico, sociale, religioso, economico dell'impero romano. Quindi si cerca appunto di evitare nell'analisi di questi temi un approccio appunto così monocasuale oppure comunque monocausale o comunque semplicistico, per cercare appunto di evitare soluzioni eccessivamente tranchant e questo mi sembra una grande ricchezza. Cedo subito la parola al professor Heather e lo ringrazio ancora per essere qui con noi.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for coming to listen to me. Even though I'm going to speak in English, I do appreciate it very much. And as yesterday, I will try not to get too excited and hence avoid speaking too quickly in order to make sure that I can be followed. It is a great pleasure to be here to try out these ideas. As I explained yesterday, it's part of a larger project that I've been working on for a long time, really. Dating these kind of projects is very difficult because, you don't teach late antique and early medieval history without thinking about religion. So although I've been spending my entire life writing about Goths, as we established yesterday, at the same time I've been thinking about religion for 30-odd, actually, if I think about when I started as an undergraduate. My first late antique paper I was studying 40 years ago. Holy Mother of God. Time passes. Make sure you enjoy every day. So yesterday I was trying out the argument for you that against current consensus in the historical writing, you have to situate the triumph of Christianity firmly within the context of the Roman Empire. And that it's simply not the case that an existing Christian structure takes over the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire transforms Christianity, and in fact, because of the particular character of conversion that we see in the late Roman period, you can actually argue even more than that the operations of public life in the late Roman Empire, the way that elite competition is mediated through the structures of the empire, that this actually is playing a major role in spreading Christianity amongst the landowning elites of the empire in every province. And that is actually the stage of conversion that you observe in the 4th and early 5th centuries. It is elite conversion. Today I want to move the chronological focus on a little further to the period in the West after 476, when the imperial system has fallen apart. The general, again, there's a general historiographical consensus about the history of Christianity in this period of crisis for the Roman imperial system. Namely that the disappearance of the West Roman imperial state changed very little in established trajectories of Christian religious development. The older historical writing simply assumed that a new form of Roman Empire, namely the papacy, quickly moved into the power vacuum left by the disappearance of Western emperors. In fact, that's crazy, but never mind. More recent writing, while not saying anything about the papacy, is heavily informed by the sort of post-cultural turn intellectual emphases of the 1970s and beyond, to suppose that deep cultural structures and their changes have very little to do with political developments. I'm thinking particularly of the work of Peter Brown, for instance, but it's also the same in Julius Smith's book about overview of Western Latin Christianity, that the fall of the empire doesn't make any particular difference to what's going on. Brown, if you read him closely, is profoundly influenced by Brodel and his book on the Mediterranean. And if you know that, there's this astonishingly ambitious and inspiring preface to the Mediterranean, where Brodel lays out 3 layers of causation, starting with landscape and climate, moving up through cultural structures and systems, and eventually ending up with politics. And in Brodel's conception, politics is not important. He calls it, in the English translation, a mere surface disturbance, something that's very misleading. If you get tied up in politics, you're missing the point. And Brown, I know, was and is profoundly influenced by Brodel. You can see it in his language. He'd left Oxford by the time I went there as an undergraduate, but everybody who taught me had been taught by Brown, and at the top of everyone's reading list is Brodel, The Mediterranean. So I started reading that and thinking about it at a very early age. And seen from that perspective, you will tend to think that, well, political change, like the end of the Roman Empire, can't be important, can't affect Christianity. What I'm going to argue this morning is that there's good reason actually to challenge that conception. I hasten to add that I remain in love with Brodel's book on the Mediterranean. I think it's a fabulous book. But the part of it that's always struck me as should stimulate one to think more is the relationship between the layers of causation that he mentions. In that preface, they're sort of sitting in isolation from one another, not in interactive, dynamic relationship. And I think that that relationship is more important and more powerful than that sort of the treatment it gets in that preface is allowing. So the fundamental hypothesis I'm going to put before you this morning is that in a whole series of ways, the disappearance of the West Roman state generated a crisis in prevailing patterns of Christianity. And we'll see whether you agree. Of course, not everything changed. There are some trajectories of development which stay the same within Christianity, and whether the empire had continued to exist, ceased to exist, whatever, I'm sure they would have been followed. The most obvious one, I think, which we talked about a little bit yesterday, is the slow transfer of Christian structures, Christian beliefs, Christianization into this 85% of the population who live in the countryside dispersed. I think this is what's so fundamentally different about Christianity and its demands compared to anything that had preceded it in the pre-Christian Roman Empire. Pre-Christian Roman Empire, as long as the peasants paid their taxes and didn't revolt, no one really cared what they believed. There is no imperative to generate monolithic cultural structures, including the peasantry, in the pre-Roman Empire. But Christianity is different because everyone has a soul. Even women have souls in Christianity. So you have to save everybody. You are under duress to save everybody. So that imperative, they're not feeling it very firmly in the 4th century, but it's there, and that's going to come out at some point. It's bound to come out. You're going to have to spread Christianity into the countryside. It's an unavoidable challenge, whatever the political structure that exists. As long as you've got a Christianized elite, you will eventually start to try to spread Christianity into the countryside, and by trial and error, you will eventually learn how to do it. So in that sense, I don't think that the spread of Christianity into the countryside is in any fundamental way changed by the fall or not fall of the empire. It would have happened. It did, of course, take a very long time, and this is what we were talking about a little bit yesterday. You know, even in the 6th century, there are hardly any churches. The major period of church building in the countryside, when you look at it in Western Europe, is from 900 AD onwards. And between 900 and 1100, huge numbers of churches are built, tens of thousands, actually, across Western Europe. I mean, if you count England, Francia, Germany, Italy, etc. You know, it's that period between 900 and 1100 that you end up with a church in every settlement. And you have to have that, and you have to have a priest in every settlement before you can demand any kind of intense Christian engagement from the mass of the population. If, as was the case in the 6th century, the average distance of most people from church is 10 kilometers, then, you know, they can be baptized, they might go to church occasionally, probably not Christmas because the weather's too horrible for a 20-kilometer walk, but they will go occasionally. Easter's probably better. And if you've got a nice Saints festival happening in July or June, you know, that will be nice. They'd probably go to that, especially if you throw in a party. But you can't have a very intense Christian piety. You also don't have trained priestly manpower. So you have some priests, you have some trained priests around cathedral precincts where bishops are. The evidence broadly suggests that in the early Middle Ages you have clusters of well-trained priests around a bishop in a bishop's household. That's where the next deacon will be. That's where the deacon lives. That's where the next bishop will be appointed from. So there's a sort of continuity of training in episcopal households. But the ordinary priests out in the countryside, we don't know what they knew. Probably not very much. The standard account of the amount of Christianity that people are trying to get into early medieval populations, and you find the same definition in Bede in England in the early 8th century as you would find in Merovingian church councils of the later 6th and early 7th century. Baptism, it's also the same in Spain, interestingly, in Isidore of Seville. Baptism, know the Lord's Prayer, know the Apostles' Creed. It's just really simple. And sermon cycles, such as there are from that period, are not preaching the intense spirituality of the 13th and 14th century. Purgatory hasn't been invented. People aren't being asked to reflect on their sins and to reflect on the death of Christ and Christ's suffering for people. It's a much simpler message. Christ's death has freed human beings from slavery to the demons. It's great. It's good. It's all good. You know, life is much better. The demons do not run your lives anymore. It's a much simpler kind of message. But of course, it's a simple message. There's not much ritual engagement. You don't go to church very often. There's a great deal of evidence, again, which we touched on briefly yesterday, excuse me, that this type of Christianity is sitting on top of an awful lot of older belief structures and older practices. In English, the word is syncretism. So, you can say mix and match religion, if you like. So people are adding bits and pieces of Christianity on top of a great deal of their inherited religious structures and beliefs. So slowly, Christianity is moving its networks into the countryside. As far as we can see, that depended on local episcopal initiative. There's no sort of centralized plan. It's individual bishops working out what they want to do and trying things out. They tell the other bishops and councils what they've tried, and ideas spread. You can see ideas spreading across the episcopates. But no one sits down and says, how are we going to spread Christianity into the countryside? Let's formulate an EU directive to make this happen. That's not the way it works. It's individual bishops who care. So in that sense, you can certainly see some continuity of religious development in the early Middle Ages, a trajectory of development that's not changed by the fall of the empire. But that isn't all that there is to say. As I was arguing yesterday in relation to late Roman elites, every time Christianity encounters a new body of religious consumers, it has to change in order to encompass and gather in those new religious consumers. Arguably, in the case of all these peasants, the proliferation of saints' cults and the modes of practice in relation to saints' cults, the kind of stuff that turns up in Gregory of Tours' miracle collections, those are a type of syncretism. They're a way of providing a Christian counterpart to all the healing shrines, all the places that you could go to swear solemn oaths that people would obey because otherwise divine nemesis would come and get them, etc., etc. So in that sense, with even our peasants, you can see, if you think of them as a new body of religious consumers, you can see how their inclusion is changing things. There's actually an interesting contrast between Caesarius of Arles at the start of the 6th century, who's trying to get rid of, pare back all of these kind of what later commentators would call superstitious additions to Christianity, and Gregory of Tours, who's embracing them happily. It's fine. And that, I think, is partly reflecting a greater degree of incorporation of the peasantry into Christian structures. But these peasants are not the only new religious consumers of the early Middle Ages. We have another group to think about, and they also changed Christianity. Because even where Roman elites survive, their pattern, as they do in sort of southern Gaul and partly in Italy and in large parts of Spain, at least until the Islamic conquest, the pattern of their lives changes. Late Roman elites are civilian. Their careers are spent pursuing political, bureaucratic careers in the structures of the Roman Empire, and the central and crucial form of preparation for those careers is an intense literary education in Latin, grammar, and rhetoric, and obviously the literature that supports that. Even where the descendants of those elites are still in place, by the mid to late 6th century, the pattern of elite lives has become fundamentally militarized. Bureaucratic structures have disappeared. The way that they serve the state is no longer paying taxes and participating in bureaucratic structures. They have to turn up and fight on a regular basis. Gregory Tour provides very nice evidence for civitas military contingents. So the civitas becomes the basis of assembling military forces, and there are enough anecdotes which show you that those civitas forces consist of the local landowners plus a portion of their dependents who turn up and fight, presumably the largest and most aggressive of their dependents. That's the people I'd take with me if I had to go on campaign. That's matched north of the Channel and to the northeast when Christian conversion takes in Franks and Anglo-Saxons. The elites there never were anything but military. But actually that military, so we have a new elite that's partly created by conversion of Anglo-Saxons and Franks, but partly created by the transformation of surviving Roman elites into a military elite. And this has consequences for Christianity. Christianity has to live with the fact that it's getting most of its main social and economic support from men and women whose lives structurally involve violence. This should be a problem, you would think. Christ said, turn the other cheek. It's amazingly not a problem, as it turns out, in the early Middle Ages. What you can do instead of looking at all these embarrassing New Testament texts is look at Old Testament texts instead, the God of battles. But you have to do that. You have to shift the emphasis. And we end up with we end up in some strange places as the church accommodates itself to the militarization of landowning elites. By the 9th, 10th century, especially as the economy simplifies, then major church institutions, the larger monasteries and all the cathedrals, are supported by large portfolios of landed estates. But those landed estates are being held liable for providing a large chunk of the military service that's owed for these kingdoms. So the best figures are from England. Because of the Norman conquest, you get comprehensive figures. The larger monasteries and cathedrals of England owe 1/3 of the entire military capacity of the Kingdom of England by the 11th century. And that, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but this is totally different from early Christianity or even late Roman Christianity. It also means, extraordinary things like the great reforming pope of the mid-11th century, Leo IX, his life tells you about his earlier stages before he becomes Bishop of Toul. And he's leading the military contingent from the bishopric of Toul on campaign because the bishop is too old and too busy to do it himself. So he's the current bishop's right-hand man. He's leading them on campaign. He's organizing where the camps go. He's making sure they're fed, that they're paid. He's laying out when they have to meet and partly their arrangement for battle. But this is a man who at the same time is a great reforming supporter of Benedictine monasticism and of church reform in general, but he doesn't bat an eyelid that his public life involves him in this military role. And many other leading clergymen of the earlier Middle Ages embraced that military and public role with even greater vigor. And nothing suggests that Leo ever fought himself, but other bishops do. We also see bishops embracing aristocratic values. Even if they don't fight, they have their own personal military forces. They're very wealthy, they go hunting, they do all of these things. We also find that early medieval elite families embrace a kind of monasticism which allows them to set up new types of trust fund. That's basically what Eigenkloster, as the Germans put it, seemed to be, as described by Bede. You can generate a new, certainly in England, it looks to be a brand new category of private property, which is owned by an individual and can be passed down by an individual. Before that, it looks as though elite families owned land in common. So you only had a lifetime interest in any land that you inherited. You didn't decide who it went to after your death. But the arrival of Roman law with a different view of property meant that you could set up a monastery, give yourself private property, and on it goes. So we can see the structures of the church being changed by its collision with newly militarized elites or the conversion of existing Anglo-Saxon and Frankish elites. But it also goes further than that, actually, I think. Remember yesterday, I was talked briefly, not really long enough, about the sort of fundamental intellectual problem presented by the set of texts out of which you construct Christianity. So the Old and the New Testament. Your fundamental problem is working out how to make this range of texts that were written in different contexts over 1,000+ years work as a religious system. They weren't designed to be a religious system. They're full of inconsistencies. Yesterday I mentioned, and we'll come back to in a minute, the different vision of Christ that's in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke compared to the Gospel of John. Well, that's only half the bloody problem. You add in the Old Testament as well, and, the range of disagreements in these texts is colossal. My favorite one, I can't remember exactly where they're from, but in the Gospels, at different points, Christ says, "Those who are not against me are for me." And another point, it says, "Those who are not for me are against me." You have to find a way to read out these inconsistencies to generate a system. And the fundamental role in this was played by the educative techniques of Latin grammarians and rhetors and the ways that they had read out the inconsistencies in their own texts. Well, it's Latin and Greek, rhetors and grammarians, of course. These are the people who'd managed to make, by the late antiquity, in fact a bit earlier, Plato and Aristotle agree with one another. And Plato and Aristotle loathed each other. But, as far as 4th century Neoplatonists are concerned, there's no contradiction between Plato and Aristotle because we'd used allegorical and other types of readings to throw away the literal inconsistency. Where this becomes important, and thinking about this in the early Middle Ages, is a huge consequence of the militarization of the elites and the fact that their lives do not focus any longer around bureaucratic service, is that they no longer have any need to send their children to grammarians and rhetors for complex literary education. And in fact, rhetors and grammarians go out of business in the late 5th century. Early 6th in Italy, they last a bit longer in Italy, There's no sign of a rhetor or a grammarian in Gaul after about 470. Ravenna, Milan, Rome still have them into the 520s, but they're gone by the end of the 6th century. Why that's important is that the whole intellectual tradition, which was, and it wasn't the finished job by 400 AD. The process is still underway of getting rid of all these disagreements between Christian texts via exegesis, basically. It's what exegesis is. It's a way of explaining away the contradictions. That process was not complete, but the intellectual structure that was responsible for getting rid of that set of differences is undermined by the militarization of elites, because this complex literary education structure disappears. By the 6th century, elites learn a bit of Latin at home. Church leaders are educated in cathedral communities. But none of these have the full range of grammatical training or even the books to be trained from. You see a fragmentation, not the disappearance of, but certainly a fragmentation and a simplification of the intellectual tradition, and that has knock-on consequences for Christianity. It basically allows people license and scope to read these texts more as they want to. In Ireland, for instance, which is converted in the 5th and 6th centuries, kings are still polygamous. They have multiple wives in the 11th century when the Normans arrive. They have multiple wives because they've read the Old Testament, and Solomon had, I can't remember, is it 700 wives and 300 concubines, or is it the other way around? I can't remember. But he had a lot of wives. There's polygamy in the Old Testament. It's fine. Old Testament example. Old Testament is a source of authority for Christianity. We won't bother reading the other texts which make that problematic. We'll read that text. And you find similar bits and pieces. Boniface in the 8th century gets into quarrels with people over what did Christ do in the 3 days before he rises again. This is the harrowing of hell. What happened during that period? Several people in the early Middle Ages are going around saying what Christ did was actually free all souls from hell. So anyone who was not baptized is freed from hell at that point. And this actually worked in the context of missionary work, because we know that ancestor cults were very important amongst early medieval elites. And there's a famous anecdote about a king of Frisia who said, "I'd rather be in hell with my ancestors than in heaven with you," when faced with a missionary. But if you can go and say, well, no, it's fine. Christ has released all your ancestors. They're in heaven too. You are facilitating conversion and allowing, of course, the syncretic continuation of ancestor cults at the same time. So the whole kind of, I suppose in a sense, refragmentation of the Christian exegetical tradition that follows on from the disappearance of the supporting substructure of Greco-Roman literary education, that loosens up Christianity in an ideological sense, makes a bigger range of readings possible. And if you have a bigger range of readings, you will have a bigger, wider range of outcomes. So Christianity has new consumers. It loses its educational structure. And this has consequences. But that's not all that's going on, actually. That's not the sort of full level of crisis that we're faced with in the post-Roman period. sort of supporting and extending this point about ideological fragmentation, there's also a crisis of authority in early medieval Christianity. And for this reason. In late Roman period, as I mentioned briefly yesterday, Christianity developed a central decision-making authority body for the first time in the form of the Ecumenical Council. But the Ecumenical Council was dependent, and its operation was dependent in every dimension upon imperial authority. It's emperors who call ecumenical councils. No one else can call them. Emperors, in practice, often set the agendas that were going to be pursued at ecumenical councils. They often shape the discussions, too, as when we start to get minutes from ecumenical councils. The imperial representatives who are presiding over the proceedings are guiding the discussion. And emperors are responsible for enforcement as well. So once decisions have been made. The disappearance of imperial authority obviously undermines any possibility of that authority structure continuing. It is sometimes argued, you'll see it argued, that already by the later 4th, 5th century, you've got a church structure that has a sense of itself as an independent corporation apart from empire. That churchmen have a sense of themselves as, a bit more like the sort of 12th, 13th century Latin church as separate from imperial power. That's worth looking at very closely. I don't think that argument stands up very well. You do find individual churchmen who criticize emperors for interfering in matters of church and theology. Every time they are churchmen who've lost the argument at this particular moment. And that is the standard line of criticism you offer. What do they do about having lost the argument? They try to win it at the imperial court. There's no separate church decision-making structure apart from the court-based ecumenical council. You have to operate in that environment. And you see that, for instance, in the 3 chapters controversy of the 6th century. Justinian produces a compromise that suits the East. It produces a storm of criticism initially in the West, orchestrated to start with by Pope Vigilius in Italy, but also a series of North African churchmen. Justinian perseveres. And what happens subsequently is very revealing, because actually the papacy comes into line and the North African church comes into line very quickly with Justinian. All the people who wouldn't accept Justinian's solution are sacked. They disappear. Actually, they bugger off to Visigothic Spain, some of them, and find refuge there. But actually, what the 3 chapters controversy shows you is that there's a crisis of imperial reach, not imperial authority. Wherever imperial political authority stretched, the church comes into line. So the 2 archbishoprics in Italy that remain critical of the 3 chapters are the 2 archbishoprics that fall under Lombard control in northern Italy in the late 6th century. Everywhere else accepts the Second Council of Constantinople and its solution for the church. So actually, there isn't a sort of separate church identity that is capable of asserting itself against imperial authority, not even by the later 6th century. The problem there is that the emperor doesn't run all of Christendom anymore. But any part of Christendom he runs, he has more than enough levers of power to bring people into line. And where there's no imperial authority, what we find in the West, what Peter Brown has called Christian microcosms, they're fundamentally built around the fact that the successor state kings inherit these same powers over the church that emperors had. So you look at Gregory of Tours. Kings appoint bishops, kings call councils. It's the same in the Visigothic context, it's the same in Anglo-Saxon England. So again, the pattern of church regional identities, that is built around functioning political leadership. The church does not have an independent existence outside of the political structures of the kingdoms in which they're operating. They do swap texts, so you get a very lively Merovingian church conciliar tradition in the late 6th and early 7th century. That's followed by a very lively Visigothic tradition in the 7th century, and the Visigoths have a copy of the conciliar decisions made by the Merovingians, etc. The Anglo-Saxons also know some of what the Merovingians have passed. So texts are passed around occasionally. They're aware that they belong to a broader Christian oikumene, I suppose, but they operate on a kingdom-by-kingdom basis. That's what gives it a fragmented structure. And where's the papacy in this? Nowhere, really. My favorite is a bit of Visigothic evidence from Braulio of Zaragotha's letter collection. There's a letter that he sends to Pope Honorius in 638, just after it coincides that the Pope's letter had arrived just as the Visigothic bishops had gathered together in council. And the Pope had been a bit critical of Visigothic bishops for their attitude to certain problems. Braulio wrote back, "The unjust arguments used by your holiness to criticize us have absolutely nothing to do with this case, if I might say so. Especially that quotation you used from Isaiah, brackets, and not from Ezekiel as you stated, although all the prophets do prophesy with one spirit. In fact, when it was opportune, we did censure transgressors, and we did not keep silent when it was our duty to preach." So Braulio is telling the Pope to bugger off and mind his own business, and actually to sort out which of the fucking Old Testament prophets he was quoting from. He'd do better than that than tell the Visigothic bishops what they should do. He also made a specific suggestion about the type of punishment that the Visigothic bishops should use in a particular case, and Braulio also sent a rejoinder about that. "We have never seen this done anywhere by the decrees of our forefathers, nor is it to be found in divine words in the pages of the New Testament. Again, dear Holiness, you've no idea what you're talking about. Mind your own business. The papacy has prestige, it has the best pilgrimage sites in Western Europe, but no one's expecting the Pope, no one thinks the Pope should, at this date, be interfering in the practical running of any of these individual Christian microcosms. There are no papal representatives at the Merovingian councils. There are no papal representatives at the Visigothic councils. They do not send the papacy their decisions. They do not ask the papacy to verify their decisions. The papacy has prestige, as we say in English, but it doesn't have authority. No one thinks that the supremacy of the Bishop of Rome should amount to real practical authority at this date. So what we're seeing is a kind of refragmentation of the church in structural authority terms that matches that ideological fragmentation that I was talking about earlier. The breaking up of the intellectual tradition is also matched by a breakup of the structures of centralizing authority that had emerged in the late Roman period. We're getting closer, in fact, to the pre-Constantinian position where local church communities are working out their own solutions to problems. We're moving back more to that in the post-Roman period than to the late Roman pattern, where things have been brought together into a more cohesive tradition. So yes, I do think the disappearance of the empire creates a whole series of important transformations in Christianity which do add up to a crisis. But actually, even that much is not the biggest crisis that the fall of the empire presents to Christianity. As you all know, I'm sure, many of the intrusive elites who established successor states to the Roman West originally adopted not imperial Roman Nicene Christianity, but Homoian Arian Christianity. Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Burgundians, although they seem to switch around a lot, and the Vandals and Alans in North Africa. Apart from relations between Nicenes and Homoians in North Africa, where there is periodic conflict, this fact is not usually thought to have represented much of a problem to developing Christianity. It's a sort of cul-de-sac, if you like, the fact that these non-Roman elites who establish the successor states are Homoian or Arian Christians rather than Nicene ones. Two important new perspectives on that problem, I think, should make us want to think about that conclusion again and think about it much harder. One very important perspective has been provided by reasonably new, I think the work was done in the 90s, new work on an African text. Survives in Leon in a 9th century copy, but it's a listing of the bishops of North Africa. It's a notitia of the bishops of the Vandal kingdom in the 480s. It records the names, and that was probably its original format, of the Nicene bishops, so Orthodox bishops, who existed in North Africa in the year 484. There are 466 of them, okay? So just over 450. And then notes have been added against some of the names later, and the internal evidence of the text suggests that these notes had been added by about 487, so within 3 years or so. So against 139 of those 466 names, a note has been added to say what's happened to them in the intervening 3 years. Some of this actually lines up with the evidence you get in Victor of Vita as to what's going on in North Africa in these years. The crucial bit is an abbreviation, PRBI, which appears next to 90. It's by far the most common note next to these names. And French scholars who've edited the text, I think, compellingly interpret the abbreviation to mean qui perierant, who have perished, and then also perished in a particular way. Because otherwise you've had an outbreak of Black Death in North Africa that's otherwise unrecorded, killing off 90 bishops, which is extremely unlikely. And that's not the context in which the word perish, perierant, is normally used in Christian context. In Christian context, it's normally a comment on the state of the soul. So the argument is that we're talking about 90 bishops who've changed sides during Huneric's persecution, which is what Victor of Vita is talking about. And actually, Huneric's persecution only lasted 6 months, from May 484, when it's launched, to the king's death in November 484. Only 6 months, but in 6 months, 90 out of 466 Catholic bishops of North Africa, 20% of the Dam Episcopate, have changed sides. That's a truly extraordinary fact, and is worth thinking about extremely hard. Amongst other things, it makes a lot of sense of Victor's text, because Victor's text ends up with this tremendously rhetorical appeal that Vandals are barbarians and Arians, and they have nothing to do with Romans who are civilized and Catholic. It's always struck me, when I first read it, why is he saying that? That should be self-evident. Well, if 90 bishops have swapped sides, you can see why he's saying that. Or they're in the process of changing sides as he's writing it. You can see why he needs to say that. Because actually those boundaries are being eroded. I mean, what that suggests, of course, is that our traditional assumption that Arians and Catholics are miles apart from one another need to be rethought. And I'm sure they do need to be rethought. In 484, the triumph of Nicene Christianity is incredibly recent. It hasn't happened more than about 2 generations ago. And a lot of people have come on side because the batteries, the legal arsenal of the Roman state has been deployed against them. Well, now the legal arsenal of the Roman state is not being deployed against them anymore, and in fact it's disappeared. And Roman state ideology claimed that gods appointed emperors. So what's happened to emperors since the early 5th century? There aren't any more, certainly not in the West. That might suggest that God isn't in fact on their side. Well, why isn't God on their side? Well, maybe they went for the wrong damn religious settlement. Maybe they got it wrong. And certainly, when you look at what Huneric did, which Victor consistently talks about him as a dreadful barbarian, well, what did Huneric do? He called a council of all churchmen of his kingdom. He held a council in Carthage in February 484. He passed through that council a particular settlement of doctrine, and then after that council, he enforced it legally. Well, who the hell does that sound like? It sounds like Justinian at Constantinople. It sounds like Theodosius at Theodosius I at the First Council of Constantinople. It sounds like Constantine at Nicaea. It sounds like Marcion at Chalcedon. He's acting like a Roman emperor. This is actually a Roman imperial process of doctrinal settlement that Huneric is pushing through. Of course, it's a slight problem that he ups and dies in the November. Suggests he might not be right either. But we are in the world before, remember, we've spread Christianity to the mass of the population in the countryside. You don't have that huge block of mass adherence that you need to shift if you change a religious settlement. So I think the Vandal evidence is telling us not to draw those lines too firmly yet. And remember, of course, that the type of religion that Huneric is going for had been imperial orthodoxy under Constantius II all the way through to the 380s. So there are a period of nearly 50 years where Hermoian Christianity is in fact imperial orthodoxy in the 4th century. And again, you've got to think about that and not make these lines too rigid. So that's the one important new perspective. The second important new perspective on this, I think, comes from the baptism of Clovis. We're obviously used to the Gregory of Tours account, where Clovis is baptized Catholic early on in his reign in the 490s and mounts a series of Catholic crusades against all comers. Danuta Schanzer and Ian Wood, looking at Avitus of Vienne, suggest a very different picture. First of all, the date, much later, possibly even after the Battle of Bouillé. Looks like it's Christmas 507, in fact, The text does suggest it's Christmas that Clovis is being baptized. But also, importantly, the context. And Avitus was invited to the baptism, so he knows what he's talking about. This is what he says about it, writing to Clovis. The chasers after various schisms, by their opinions, different in nature, many in number, but all empty of truth, tried to conceal, under the cover of the name Christian, the lives that have been uncovered by the keen intelligence of your subtlety. A ray of truth has shone through. Divine foresight has found a certain judge for our age. In making a choice for yourself, you judge on behalf of everyone. Your faith is our victory. And this is Avitus, letter 75. What that suggests, of course, is that Clovis was choosing between different types of Christianity, namely between Homoian Christianity and Catholic Christianity. But that's the context. In fact, several of his relatives, we know his sisters, converted to Homoian Christianity, not least the one who marries Theodoric, the Ostrogoth. And in fact, I think you can see the choice of Nicene Catholic Christianity in the context of Clovis eventually choosing Constantinople over Ravenna in the context of his diplomatic relations and making a break with Theodoric in the middle of the first decade of the 6th century, which wasn't there before. Think about this, though. What if Clovis had chosen the other way, which he might have done? If Clovis had actually decided, Theodoric is the better alliance, Constantinople's all well and good, but it's a long way away. I'll go for Arian, Homoian Christianity. At that point, every royal court of the Western successor state world would have been Homoian. Because this is before Justinian. This is before Justinian has destroyed the Vandal and the Ostrogothic kingdoms. What on earth would have happened subsequently if Clovis had chosen Arian Christianity? Well, I think if you look at what happens in the Greek East after the Islamic conquest, you can see exactly what was likely to have happened. What happens after the Islamic conquest is really very interesting. Islam is tolerant in the first. Well, it is tolerant towards Christianity. It doesn't try to extirpate it. Christians can exist. And in fact, if you look at biographical information, as in the family of John of Damascus, or if you look at the Egyptian papyri, you see that the existing structures of administration and the existing Christian personnel who run it are still in place for the first 50 years. There isn't any change. And apart from the disappearance of one or two very rich families in Egypt, and you can see why they wouldn't have survived the conquest. The Appians disappear, for instance. But the sort of medium and local gentry landowner levels stay there. They're still Christian. They're still involved in public life. They're still running everything. And we know, in Damascus, John of Damascus's grandfather and father are leading administrators of a whole series of Umayyad caliphs in the later 7th century. But that changes. And it changes in the second 50 years after the conquest. Trajectories of first Arabization, so the administration shifts to Arabic, but also Islamicization. So the personnel who are involved in public life have to become, first of all, competent in Arabic, but then actually Muslim. And you see the same thing, actually, in 9th century Spain. The Cordoban martyr phenomenon is tied up with exactly that process of spreading Arabization through the administration and then a demand that you come into line with the Islamic religion of the dominant political structures. It's another example of exactly what I was arguing about, why the late Roman elites become Christian. if you've got a dominant political structure that you need to be part of to maintain your elite status, and it has a cultural dimension that is different to yours, you will feel a lot of pressure eventually over time to make these shifts. You can see what I'm suggesting. There will always be exceptions. Some people will refuse to come into line. John of Damascus left the service of Umayyad caliphs rather than becoming Muslim. Isaac Tabernas and several of the other martyrs of Cordoba refused to come into line. But when you read their stories, you see that the backdrop is a lot of other people who are coming into line, actually, at that point, who are learning Arabic and who are accepting the fact that continue to function in public life in Islamic contexts, you will have to become Muslim. And of course, that's an extraordinary moment because in reality, the beating heart of late Roman Christianity is Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. You know, these aren't out-of-the-way parts of North Africa. If we were to do a survey of Christian leaders of the later Roman Empire, the vast majority of them, the vast majority of the key thinkers and dominant voices come from these places. But even in these places where Christianity has the deepest, oldest roots, the beating heart of late Roman Christianity, then the elites find themselves under inescapable pressure to conform. Take that perspective back to a Western world where Clovis chooses Hermoian Christianity and every monarch of the Western world is a Hermoian Christian. I think you can see what is likely to have happened. Wouldn't have happened suddenly. These kings could coexist with Catholic administrators, but already we've got certain Italian nobles learning Gothic and others in the Rhone Valley learning Burgundian that turn up in our sources. Don't throw in Justinian's campaigns, leave those, pretend they don't happen. Give it 50 years, and the route to favor, preference, and success under these monarchs is going to be cultural assimilation, cultural coming into line. So, time to stop. You can see what I'm arguing. It's very straightforward. I think it's nonsense to say that Christianity doesn't face a crisis with the fall of the Roman Empire. Its engagement with the Roman state produced one revolution in Christianity. The disappearance of the Roman state ought to, if my first argument is correct, have generated crisis when it disappears. But I don't think I'm making this up because I wanted to find it. It's there. You can see it's there. We lose our central authority structures. We see a fragmentation of the exegetical tradition, which allows a much wider range of readings of the texts. We see the engagement with militarized elite consumers and peasant elite consumers changing Christianity again. And there's also more than a sniff of existential crisis for Nicene Christianity in a battle with Hermoian Christianity. You know, if 20% of the North African episcopate can change sides in 6 months, then you put in Arian Hermoian kings for 100 years, and I think what is likely to happen is a full-scale change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for giving us this rich and complex picture of the Western Europe in this period. And abbiamo tempo per articolare la discussione e domande. My question is related to the role of the bishops in between 5th and the 6th century. I don't know if behind the choice of Clovis there was also the necessity of control the territories where he has a lot of bishops who could help you to do it. And there is also, of course, a problem of international relations with Italy and with the Eastern Empire. But I don't know if he had also a problem of ruling the territories which was Roman and controlled by the bishops.
I'm sure that comes into his thinking and into his calculations. In many ways, of course, you do make life easier for yourself by choosing Nicene Christianity. And I think it's, if you think about the choices made by different kings at different moments, the sort of the more aggressive choice of the Vandals to hold to not the imperial version of Christianity, that I'm sure is reflecting the fact that the Vandal kingdom has very particular origins. You know, it's the other states sort of emerge out of the disappearance of imperial power. The Vandals carve out a kingdom by violence while the empire still exists. And that is going to make for a very different ideological cost-benefit analysis as to which religious choice you make. And of course, by the time that Clovis is making his choice, there's no Western Empire left, so you don't have to differentiate yourself from an imperial structure at all anymore, which is what the Goths and the Vandals are having to do at an earlier date. So there's no imperative there. It is also true that we've had 100 years or so of aristocratic bishops. The first generation of aristocratic bishops in the West is sort of Ambrose, as far as we can see, in sort of 370 or thereabouts. So, you know, someone like Sidonius stands in the tradition of important landowner bishops. And in that context, I think you're right, another dimension of the choice would certainly be that the church has taken on some administrative roles in this context, and they'll run localities for you more easily. On the other hand, Visigothic bishops, or the Catholic bishops of the Visigothic kingdom, seem to have got on perfectly well with non-Nicene kings. I don't see that there's a lot of evidence that it would have created a huge structural problem to pick Homoian Christianity if Clovis had done so. But I can see that it does make life easier. The bishops like you much more, that's for sure. But Alaric II had just held this huge council in 505 and had called another one for 507. So he was finding ways as an Arian king to get on with his Catholic bishops when Clovis comes along.
Thank you for your lecture. I have a pair of questions. The first is, I would like to address an important theme between Christianity and Rome, and is the dispute in late antiquity over the fate of the Roman Empire, because we see a breakup in between the Christian thinkers. As we see on one side, a millenarist tendency, which even comes to see the barbarians which destroys the empire as hammers of God, as a punishment. And another line against which Augustine writes in De Civitate Dei, which makes the Roman Empire the key element which helped the spread of Christianity. And it is the more interesting as we think of what happens between Augustine and Orosius. Augustine asks Orosius to write a history for him so he can write better the Civitate Dei. But then, as when he realizes that Orosius has loathed too much Roman aspects of history, Augustine doesn't consider really Orosius' history in his plan. The second question was about Ireland, and it seems to me, maybe I am wrong, that in the first time of Irish Christianization, and as you have said, Christianity was indeed very tolerant of local traditions. We see that we have preserved early Irish law from that period, which has even the entire corpuses about the different type of Irish marriages, and then we have the preservation of we have the syncretism of the Tuatha De Dan. And so I wanted to ask, how long lasted this relative tolerance of Christendom to the local traditions of Ireland?
Thank you for your questions. I'll start with Augustine. Augustine is really interesting, I think, and the argument that he puts forward in The City of God is a very arresting and striking one. He's basically arguing that no state constructed by humans in this world will ever be so central to God's plans that it will last forever. You know, God uses what turns up. God partly creates what turns up, but nothing is so in tune with the divine will that it can be considered essential, I suppose would be the right word. God needs this. He doesn't. He's using it, and there'll be something else. What's very interesting about that argument? Well, it's very sophisticated. I mean, Augustine is not my favorite person, but he is a very, very smart person, and you always get an interesting answer from Augustine. You never get a simple or obvious answer. You always get a very thoughtful one. But what strikes me about it is that this is a view of the world that's framed directly against the claims that the Roman imperial state makes about itself, and that what emperors claim about themselves. They claim exactly the opposite. They claim that they are uniquely in tune with the divine will, that the Roman state has been put there for cosmological reasons, that this is the ultimate apex of possible human societies, that indeed the Roman state is totally central to God's plans. You can't imagine God's plans without the Roman Empire. And, I mean, it's not only an ideological claim, it is a central motivating idea that's played out in every ceremonial moment of public life in the Roman world. This is something I'd love to write a book on, really, is just thinking about all these ceremonial moments where these ideas are either implicitly or explicitly rehearsed. I think you just never escape them. I think they're in your face 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You know, you've got a fragment surviving of town council minutes from one town in Egypt. And they start off with a series of shouted acclamations which rehearse these ideas. Every bloody town council, every 1800 town councils in the empire started off with these kinds of ritual shoutings which rehearsed these ideas. You see it in the senatorial minutes which record the presentation of the Theodosian Code on Christmas Day to the Senate in Rome, and on, the panegyrics, of which there are probably 60 a year. I can't imagine how many there were. Every court moment, a lot of local public life too, these ideas are in your face. And this seems to me important for understanding two things. First, how brilliant Augustine is to think the unthinkable. He's thinking the unthinkable in the city of God. And you see just what a kind of extraordinary person he is, actually, I think, in that. But also, you've got to not give it too much significance, because you've got Augustine shouting in the wilderness in Carthage and Hippo against an absolute barrage of the opposite being said. Most people do not get exposed to Augustine's ideas. Most people just get the imperial claims. And that's what they live with, and that's what's shaping their lives. For us, we can see the interesting intellectual progression that Augustine represents. And we know that the empire is going to end. No one knew in 410 or 420 that the empire was going to end. They clearly didn't. And the types of deals that the Visigoths are doing with the Roman state in 420 suggest they don't think it's going to end either. They don't even think it's going to end in the 450s. So, it comes as a great shock when this system unravels. So I resist, as it were, building too teleological a line of progression in intellectual thought there. Augustine is ahead of the game and very insightful, but I think most people are still buying imperial propaganda and still thinking in terms of it. So I suppose that's kind of my response to that. On Ireland, well, it's until very late. As I said, we've still got polygamous kings when Norman adventurers move on from England into Ireland in the late 11th century. That's in the 1080s and the 1090s, I think, that Norman adventurers go there. And as they carve out territorial lordships in Ireland, they bring their churchmen with them, and the churchmen, Latin churchmen from the continent, find Irish Christianity extremely odd at that point. We know that the Viking period generated an period of intense crisis in the Irish church, so it's a bit hard to know to what extent and exactly how it had been restructured after the sort of 9th century crisis, but certainly it's very much out of step still with continental Christianity in circa 1100. So, that's the best answer I can give you, I think. Thank you.
Altre domande? Carlo.
Yes, thank you. I was curious to know your idea about Ralph Matheson's assumption that, Arian bishopric or, Arian bishops, especially in the Visigothic kingdoms and Burgundian kingdom, does not have a strong hierarchical structure, and that's why he says the conflict with Nicene bishops didn't burst out as it could have happened, and on the contrary, in a recent book about Arianism, I think of about four years ago, Ute Heil, on the contrary, stated that Arian bishopric was just about Nicene bishopric. So every bishop had his own church, and there was a strong hierarchical structure just in the Nicene bishopric. So I just wanted to know if which model do you think the most plausible? Because they really state two very different things about that.
They do say some very different things. And I think I'm probably halfway in between in this. I promise I don't always go for safe positions, as you may have noticed. In the sense that, as far as I can see, there's more evidence from Visigothic Spain than anywhere else. And that suggests that you do have several Arian bishops, but they're in specific places, which I would myself, I'm an old-fashioned barbarian. I believe in barbarians, I believe in barbarian settlement. There, I've said it, I believe in barbarian settlement and identity. In other words, the settlers end up in specific places, and I think you establish ecclesiastical structures to service those communities in the first instance. If you think about, for instance, what emerges from the Gothic War of where Ostrogoths are settled in Italy, they're settled in the northwest around Milan, they're settled in the northeast around Verona and then Ravenna, and then there are a series of communities up and down the Via Flaminia. It seems to me that the evidence is not so good from Ostrogothic Italy as it is for Spain, but if I was in charge of the Arian Church in Italy, then I would be establishing branches of the Arian Church near my clustered settlements. And, you can see exactly, there's a strategic logic as to where those settlements are. I don't think it's remotely random. And I think that also works if you look at where the documented bishops, Arian bishops, are in Visigothic Spain as well. So I kind of think that. I doubt very much that you automatically create an Arian bishop for Malaga where there's no Goth, for instance. But I think everywhere you establish any kind of major Gothic presence as part of your reconfiguration of the kingdom in the 490s, when the Chronicle of Zaragoza tells us that there was a large-scale movement from Aquitaine into Spain, then I would imagine, but it is a hypothesis, that at that point you would be setting up branches of the church, of your Hermoian church. So it's a guess, But I think Matheson is going for deliberately minimizing reading. And I think, we were talking about this a little bit over dinner last night, I think you have to allow, first of all, for the range of possibility that the evidence lays open. And I think Uta Heilsbrook is perhaps going for too big a reading, and Matheson is going for too minimal a reading. Neither are impossible, it's just they both seem a bit unlikely. Yeah.
I am very grateful for your splendid lecture. Just one observation. Ireland, it's a very peculiar and interesting case study. The polygamy, it's not the only phenomenon linked to the past. If I read Topographia Iberniae by Geraldo Cambrensis, you can find a lot of pre-Christian use and situation with the approval of priests. Very interesting, strange and very, very pagan. I am afraid that the final crisis with Cromwell, the crash and the division between past and present for Ireland.
Yes. I think that these early medieval missionaries offered very generous deals when it came to conversion very often. You have the stuff from Iceland is very interesting. You're allowed even to carry on sacrificing to the old gods as long as you do it in private. Couldn't do it in public anymore.
Yes.
And
the ritual of intronization of king is
yes.
very strange.
Yes.
Wow.
I honestly think that much of early medieval Christianity would be a thin layer on top of everything else that you were normally doing. I mean, there were certain changes. In Germanic societies, it does look as though Christian marriage laws were a serious change, particularly the ban on marrying, well, it's not close relatives, it's actually very distant relatives within Christianity. It's a much wider incest law than anything that genetic problems would demand. And that seems to have caused a problem both in Anglo-Saxon England and Frisia, for instance, when it came to marriage practice. So I think that there are some particular, but that of course is recorded amongst the elite, who I think probably have to come a bit more into line, and it has a bit more impact on that. But yeah, I do think, for the most part, we've got absolutely no idea what most people are doing in the countryside, and I would take it that, yeah, they probably baptize, but that's about it. Yeah, absolutely.
Altre domande?
Thank you very much for your lecture, very interesting. I just thinking about the Enoticon of Emperor Zeno.
Yeah.
Do you think this document is a symptom of the crisis of imperial authority also in the Pars Orientis of Roman Empire, especially in the second half of 5th century? Because there are, after the Chalcedonian Council, there are no other great council until Justinian. So there could be not a compromise between Monophysites and Chalcedonian, but a sort of crisis of imperial authority that has no capacity to control the church life also in oriental part of Roman Empire. What is your opinion about the Enoticon?
Yeah, the Enoticon and what follows afterwards is a very interesting passage, I think. On imperial councils, I think they tend not to call imperial councils until they're more or less certain that they can make them work in terms of generating an outcome. Justinian doesn't call his council until he's done about 10 years of preparatory work. The doctrinal settlement that he pushes through in the Second Council of Constantinople is already being talked about in the 530s. It's advertised in some edicts of the 540s. There's been a huge amount of preparation before you go to the trouble of gathering everyone together. It's a bit like, holding a Middle East peace conference. You don't hold one until you can end up with a success, because otherwise it's just terrible to try and do this and fail. The Enoticon is very interesting, I think. It does come just after the disappearance of Western imperial structures, and you do wonder if Zeno's vision is purely Eastern, where, of course, the Enoticon is a kind of compromise which works reasonably well for most of the Eastern Empire. Not all of it, but more of it seems to be in line with the Henoticon than not. The problem with the Henoticon comes with you're bound to get a Western rejection of it. So if you're no longer caring about what happens in the West, the Henoticon is not a bad line of compromise, perhaps to be pushing in the East. But the thing to remember, I think, also about about Zeno, is that he's never securely on that throne. He seizes it in a very improvised manner. He's then in exile for 18 months. He faces constant threats and constant revolts. The usurpations, a whole series of usurpers launched against him, Longinus, Illus, etc. Theodoric turns up outside the walls of Constantinople with his army on at least 2 occasions. Zeno is in no position to run any kind of coherent church policy, I think. I would be thinking about it in that kind of context too. I mean, if you compare that to Justinian's decade of preparations for the Second Council of Constantinople and the religious settlement that he tries to push through there, you can see that there's a huge difference in context.
Well, first of all, thank you for your fascinating lecture. I'd like to ask you, well, kind of a stupid question, maybe.
There are no stupid questions.
Exactly. Don't challenge me. Well, how to interpret the rise of personal military forces directly controlled by the Pope, late 7th to the early 9th century? I'm talking about the Militia Saltisina or Militia Capracorum, in light of this process of, militarization of society and also the rise of new consumers of Christianity.
No, sure.
This was my stupid question.
No, it's not. There's nothing stupid about that question at all. I think the interesting thing there is always who's controlling whom, in the sense that once you've declared independence of the Byzantine state in the 720s, whoever is currently Bishop of Rome is acting as frontman for these aristocratic networks of central and southern Italy. And what strikes me more than anything is the degree of competition between those networks for control of the papal office.
Was the controversies only icons that
yes.
Contemporary to this?
No, sure. I mean, it's papal election process make your hair stand on end when you see what's going on. The Carolingians stopped them from doing most of what they want to do to each other, but the rival contenders for power are brutal, and I think that's because, and it gets worse, I think, after Charlemagne gives them so much extra revenue, because then there's so much more to argue about. So you want your man to be pope to make sure that your network gets the full benefit of leases and grants and control of markets and tolls and all this kind of thing. So I think if we had better information about and better detail about who the networks are, how they're formed, and the relationship of individual popes to individual networks, we would understand that relationship better. But I think it does fit into that sort of broader pattern. The Carolingians basically have to make the papacy play a larger role in public church affairs of the Western Church.
The prestige and the beginning of authority.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yes. It's a sort of it's a very important sub-regional phenomenon, in a sense, the papacy, until the Carolingians make it be something else. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No, you're very welcome.
Possiamo ringraziare il professor Eder per queste 2 bellissime lezioni e speriamo di averlo nuovamente qui presto. Grazie.
Thank you very much.